The underestimated human. The Galactic Military Institute towered above the crystal plains of Nexus Prime like a monument to organized violence. Its spiraling towers housed the most advanced war simulation technology in known space, drawing military minds from across 17 different star systems. The morning sun cast long shadows through the Institute's transparent walls, illuminating corridors filled with beings whose very presence suggested they could calculate the trajectory of a plasma bolt while composing poetry in 3 different languages. Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the entrance of Simulation Chamber Alpha, her simple black uniform a stark contrast to the elaborate technological gear worn by everyone around her. She clutched a standard translation device and a worn notebook, looking like someone who had accidentally wandered into the wrong building. The other occupants of the corridor paid her no attention, which was exactly how Sarah preferred it. The Xanthari delegation glided past her, their elongated skulls pulsing with soft blue light as they communicated telepathically. Their leader, Commander Vexhai, acknowledged Sarah with a brief nod. The Xanthari had been the first to request human, linguistic support, though Sarah suspected it was more about political correctness than actual need. Most species in the galaxy had developed universal translators that made her job seemingly obsolete. Behind them came the Vraconi contingent, their cybernetic implants humming with barely contained energy. General Korthax's mechanical eye whirred as it focused on Sarah, scanning her with the sort of clinical interest usually reserved for particularly interesting specimens. The Vraconi had enhanced their biological brains with quantum processors centuries ago, making them living computers capable of processing information at speeds that would make artificial intelligence jealous. The Corvani brought up the rear, moving in perfect synchronization as their hive mind coordinated their movements. Admiral Zephok spoke for the group, though Sarah knew that the consciousness behind those words was distributed across all 47 members of their delegation. They had evolved beyond individual thought, becoming a collective intelligence that could analyze problems from dozens of perspectives simultaneously. And then there was Sarah, representing humanity with nothing more than her biology degree and an unusual talent for languages. She had been assigned to this prestigious gathering almost by accident, filling in for Dr. Martinez, who had fallen ill just days before the simulation began. The Galactic Council had insisted on human representation, though nobody seemed quite sure why. The simulation chamber itself was a marvel of engineering that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The spherical room was lined with holographic projectors that could recreate entire star systems in perfect detail. Neural interface pods surrounded a central command platform, each one designed to connect directly with the enhanced minds of the participants. The whole setup looked like the inside of a mechanical brain, which Sarah supposed was exactly what it was. The Great War simulation will commence in 30 minutes, announced the chamber's artificial intelligence, its voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Participants, please take your positions at the designated neural interface stations. The alien commanders moved to their pods with practiced efficiency. Each interface was customized for their particular species. The Xanthari pods glowed with soft telepathic amplifiers, the Vraconi stations hummed with quantum processing arrays, and the Corvani setup included multiple connection points for their collective consciousness. Sarah found herself directed to a simple observation chair in the corner of the chamber. No neural interface, no quantum processors, no telepathic amplifiers. Just a comfortable seat with a good view of the central display. The technician who showed her to the chair, a young Xanthari whose head ridges marked him as barely past adolescence, seemed almost apologetic. The translator station, he explained, his mental voice carrying undertones of embarrassment. From here you can monitor all communications and provide linguistic support as needed. The recording systems will capture everything for later analysis. Sarah smiled and settled into the chair. This is perfect, thank you. She opened her notebook and clicked her pen, ready to take notes the old-fashioned way. The technician's confusion was palpable, but he said nothing as he returned to his duties. The simulation parameters materialized in the air above the central platform, displaying a scenario that would have challenged the greatest military minds in galactic history. Three major powers found themselves locked in a complex struggle for control of the resource-rich Omega sector. Each faction controlled hundreds of worlds, thousands of ships, and millions of personnel. The economic, political, and military variables were so interconnected that the simulation required its own dedicated quantum computer array just to track the basic relationships. The hegemony of worlds, led by Commander Vex-High, represented the old guard of galactic civilization. Their strategy focused on overwhelming technological superiority and the sort of methodical planning that had kept them in power for millennia. Their fleets were smaller but more advanced, their tactics refined through centuries of calculated warfare. General Korthax commanded the Cybernetic Collective, a loose alliance of species that had embraced technological enhancement as the path to evolution. Their approach favored rapid adaptation and the sort of creative problem-solving that came from minds that could process multiple scenarios simultaneously. They compensated for their smaller numbers with superior coordination and technological innovation. Admiral Zephok led the Unity Coalition, representing species that had evolved collective consciousness as their primary advantage. Their strategy relied on perfect coordination and the ability to make decisions without the communication, delays that plagued individual-minded species. They could execute complex maneuvers that would have been impossible for any other type of military organization. The simulation began with the sort of dramatic flair that suggested someone had been watching too many entertainment holovids. Charts materialized, showing the initial positions of the three fleets. Economic data cascaded through the air in streams of pure information. Diplomatic channels opened as the factions began the careful dance of negotiation, alliance, and betrayal that would define the coming conflict. Sarah watched from her corner, taking notes in her neat handwriting as the alien commanders interfaced with their neural pods. Their enhanced minds began processing information at superhuman speeds, analyzing thousands of variables simultaneously. The Zenthari delegation moved in perfect mental synchronization, their telepathic coordination allowing them to share thoughts and strategies instantaneously. The Vraconi contingent began their characteristic rapid-fire analysis, their cybernetic implants processing data streams that would have overwhelmed biological brains. Numbers flowed through their consciousness like water, each calculation building on the previous ones to create increasingly complex strategic models. The Corvani collective became a single entity, their individual bodies merely terminals for a distributed intelligence that could examine problems from multiple angles simultaneously. They spoke in perfect unison, their voices creating harmonics that seemed to resonate with the chamber's own acoustic properties. Hours passed as the simulation unfolded. Fleets maneuvered through space, their movements governed by physics so complex that the calculations required quantum processors to handle the computations. Battles erupted across multiple star systems, each engagement involving variables that would have challenged entire universities of military theorists. Sarah continued to sit quietly in her corner, her pen moving steadily across the pages of her notebook. To the casual observer, she appeared to be taking simple notes about the linguistic patterns of the various species, documenting the subtle differences in their communication styles and tactical terminology. What wasn't immediately apparent was the scope of what she was actually recording. The first major engagement occurred 18 hours into the simulation. The hegemony's third fleet encountered a collective scouting force in the Tau Ceti system, leading to a running battle that stretched across 3 planetary orbits. The combat involved over 200 ships, each with its own tactical profile and combat capabilities. The battle's outcome would influence resource allocation for the next 30 hours of simulation time. Commander Vex-High's fleet utilized their traditional hammer and anvil tactics, using their heavy cruisers to pin the enemy, while their lighter ships maneuvered for killing strikes. General Korthax responded with rapid redeployment patterns that seemed to defy conventional military logic, but made perfect sense when analyzed by enhanced minds capable of processing multiple variables simultaneously. Sarah watched the battle unfold on the central display, her eyes tracking the movement of individual ships as they danced through space. Her pen never stopped moving, filling page after page with what appeared to be simple observations about communication patterns and tactical terminology. The simulation's complexity continued to increase as the hours passed. Political crises erupted on dozens of worlds as the war's economic impact rippled through civilian populations. Technological breakthroughs occurred in response to battlefield necessities, creating new weapon systems and defensive measures that changed the fundamental nature of the conflict. By the end of the first day, the alien commanders had processed more information than most planetary governments handled in a year. Their enhanced minds worked tirelessly, analyzing supply lines, coordinating fleet movements, and managing the countless details that determined the fate of entire star systems. Sarah had filled nearly half of her notebook with what appeared to be linguistic observations. To anyone glancing at her notes, she seemed to be documenting the fascinating diversity of alien communication styles, noting how the Zenthari used emotional undertones in their telepathic communications, how the Vraconi integrated mathematical concepts into their basic vocabulary, and how the Corvani collective spoke in patterns that reflected their distributed consciousness. What none of them realized was that Sarah was recording everything, not just the communications, but the tactical decisions, the strategic reasoning, the resource allocations, the diplomatic exchanges, and even the subtle body language that revealed the commander's true thoughts about their positions. Her human brain, unencumbered by the technological interfaces that channeled and limited the aliens' enhanced minds, was absorbing the entire scope of the simulation with the sort of natural capacity that evolution had provided free of charge. The first day ended with the three factions locked in a complex stalemate, each having gained and lost advantages in equal measure. The alien commanders disconnected from their neural interfaces, their enhanced minds needing time to process the vast amounts of information they had absorbed. They spoke in the careful, measured tones of beings whose consciousness had been stretched to its limits. Sarah closed her notebook and stretched, feeling the pleasant fatigue that came from a day of intense concentration. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the simulation continued, but for now, she was content to have observed the opening moves of what promised to be an extraordinary game of galactic chess. None of the alien commanders paid her any attention. As they filed out of the chamber, their minds focused on the complex calculations that would determine their strategies for the coming day. They had no idea that the quiet human in the corner had just accomplished something that their enhanced minds would have considered impossible. Sarah had remembered everything. The impossible memory, 847 hours. That was how long the Great War simulation had been running when disaster struck, with the sort of timing that suggested the universe had a particularly twisted sense of humor. Sarah had filled 17 notebooks with her careful observations, watching as the three galactic powers fought their way through a conflict that had reshaped entire sectors of space. The simulation had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations. What began as a strategic exercise had evolved into something approaching actual warfare, with consequences that rippled through hundreds of star systems. The hegemony's methodical approach had given way to desperate improvisation as the collective's technological innovations outpaced their traditional advantages. The Unity Coalition had fractured and reformed twice, their hive-mind consciousness adapting to losses that would have crippled individually minded species. Sarah sat in her corner, as she had for the past 5 weeks, watching the final phase of the simulation unfold. The alien commanders had pushed their enhanced minds to the very limits of their capabilities, processing information streams that would have overwhelmed entire planetary governments. Their neural interfaces glowed with the soft light of consciousness stretched thin, quantum processors working at maximum capacity to handle the simulation's exponential complexity. Then the alarms began to sound. The first sign of trouble was a flicker in the holographic displays, the star charts wavering like images reflected in disturbed water. Commander Vexahai's telepathic communication cut off mid-sentence, his mental voice dissolving into static that made the other Zenthari clutch their heads in pain. General Korthax's cybernetic implants sparked, sending cascades of error messages through his enhanced consciousness. The quantum processing array that powered the simulation began to emit a high-pitched whine that seemed to resonate in the very structure of the chamber. The neural interface pods started flashing warning lights as their connections to the central system became unstable. Admiral Zephok's collective consciousness fragmented, the 47 members of the Corvani delegation suddenly speaking in different voices as their shared mind lost coherence. "System overload," announced the chamber's artificial intelligence, its usually calm voice now carrying harmonics of barely controlled panic. "Quantum cascade failure in primary processing arrays, initiating emergency shutdown protocols." The holographic displays collapsed into static, centuries of simulated warfare dissolving into meaningless visual noise. The neural interfaces went dark, severing the commander's connections to the simulation that had consumed their lives for the past month. Emergency lighting activated, casting harsh shadows across the chamber as the primary systems failed one by one. Director Thalen, the Verconi administrator responsible for the simulation, materialized in the chamber with the sort of dramatic timing that suggested either excellent crisis management skills or really unfortunate luck. His cybernetic implants cast flickering light across his face as he surveyed the scene, his enhanced mind already calculating the implications of what he was seeing. "Status report," he demanded, his voice carrying the sort of authority that came from managing disasters that could reshape interstellar politics. The lead technician, a young Xanthari whose telepathic abilities had been overwhelmed by the system's psychic feedback, struggled to form coherent thoughts. "Complete data loss, Director. The quantum matrices overloaded trying to process the simulation's recursive complexity loops. We've lost everything: fleet positions, battle histories, diplomatic records, economic data, even the basic scenario. Parameters." Director Thalen's cybernetic eye whirred as it focused on the blank displays. "The backup systems? Also corrupted, sir. The cascade failure propagated through all redundant networks. We don't even have partial records." The technician's mental voice carried undertones of professional horror. 847 hours of simulation data, completely gone. The silence that followed was the sort usually reserved for moments when entire civilizations realized they had made fundamental errors in their understanding of reality. The alien commanders sat in their darkened neural pods, their enhanced minds suddenly cut off from the simulation that had defined their existence for the past 5 weeks. Commander Vex-High was the first to speak, his telepathic voice carrying frequencies that roughly translated to profound despair, mixed with bureaucratic panic. "The Galactic Military Council is expecting our final analysis within the standard cycle. This simulation represents the culmination of 3 years of preparation and the combined resources of 17 star systems." General Korthax's cybernetic implants flickered as he processed the scope of the disaster. "Without the simulation data, there's no way to evaluate the strategic doctrines we've been developing, the technological innovations, the tactical adaptations, the diplomatic protocols, all of it lost." Admiral Zephok's collective consciousness had managed to reassemble itself, though the strain was evident in the way the Corvani delegation moved, with slightly less than perfect coordination. The economic implications alone will require months to recalculate: the resource allocation models, the trade route optimizations, the population displacement patterns. We've lost the foundation for an entire generation of military planning. Director Thalen's expression had progressed from professional concern to the sort of existential dread usually reserved for people who had just realized they were about to become historically significant for all the wrong reasons. "We could restart the simulation, but that would require another 800 hours, and the quantum arrays won't be operational for weeks." "Excuse me," said a quiet voice from the corner of the chamber. Everyone turned to stare at Sarah, who had risen from her observation chair with the sort of calm confidence that people displayed when they either had excellent solutions or had completely lost touch with reality. Her stack of notebooks sat neatly beside her chair, filled with what everyone assumed were simple linguistic observations. "I can reconstruct the simulation," she said simply. The silence that followed was the sort usually reserved for moments when someone announced they had figured out how to reverse entropy or had discovered the meaning of life written on the back of a restaurant menu. Director Thalen's cybernetic eye refocused on Sarah with the sort of attention usually reserved for potentially explosive devices. "I beg your pardon?" "The war game," Sarah continued, apparently unaware that she had just suggested something roughly equivalent to rebuilding. A demolished city using only memory and determination. I can recreate the entire simulation from beginning to end. Fleet movements, battle outcomes, diplomatic exchanges, resource allocations, technological developments, everything. General Korthax's mechanical components whirred as he processed this statement. You took no notes on the tactical data. You accessed no information streams. You have no neural enhancements. The simulation contains billions of discrete data points across 847 hours of real-time progression. Sarah glanced at her notebooks with the sort of modest expression that suggested she either didn't understand the magnitude of what she was proposing or had grown accustomed to casual impossibility. I was watching. That's what I do. I observe and remember. Commander Vexhi's telepathic communication carried frequencies that indicated either intense curiosity or the onset of a complete psychological breakdown. No biological neural network could possibly process and retain that volume of information. The quantum storage requirements alone would exceed the capacity of most planetary computer systems. Would you like me to start from the beginning? Sarah asked, settling back into her chair with the sort of comfortable confidence that teachers displayed when they were about to explain something complicated to students who weren't quite ready to understand it. She opened her first notebook and began to speak, her voice carrying the steady rhythm of someone reciting information they knew by heart. Hour 0, initial deployment phase. The hegemony of worlds positioned their primary fleet in the Epsilon, Eridani system, with Admiral Korath commanding from the battleship Inevitable Victory. Initial force composition: 53 capital ships, 247 cruisers, 896 destroyers, and supporting logistics craft. Sarah paused, looking around the chamber with the sort of expression that suggested she was checking whether her audience was paying attention. The cybernetic collective deployed their main battle group in the Wolf 359 cluster under General Vextar, commanding from the Dreadnought Calculated Response. Their initial composition favored technological superiority over raw numbers: 31 advanced capital ships, 168 next-generation cruisers, 412 prototype destroyers, with mobile construction platforms for rapid technological adaptation. Director Thalen felt his cybernetic implants begin to process something that might have been hope, or might have been the onset of a stress-induced system malfunction. Continue. The Unity Coalition established their command structure across the Centauri Collective, with Admiral Zephok's consciousness distributed among their fleet commanders. They utilized their coordination advantages to deploy a balanced force of 42 capital ships, 193 cruisers, 517 destroyers, and the largest logistics network of the three factions. Sarah began to walk around the chamber, her movements casual and unhurried as if she were discussing the weather rather than reconstructing the most complex military simulation ever created. Hour 1 through 17, initial positioning phase. The hegemony focused on establishing secure supply lines through the Tau Ceti corridor, while the collective immediately began technological reconnaissance of enemy positions. The coalition initiated diplomatic overtures to both factions, while secretly reinforcing their border systems. She continued for the next 6 hours, her voice never wavering, her memory apparently as inexhaustible as a stellar fusion reactor. She recited fleet movements with the precision of a navigation computer, described battle formations with the accuracy of a tactical analyst, and recalled diplomatic exchanges with the detail of someone who had been present for every conversation. Hour 43, the Battle of the Kepler Junction. Commander Vexhi's Second Fleet encountered General Korthax's advanced reconnaissance force in the asteroid field surrounding Kepler 442b. Initial engagement involved 67 ships on the hegemony side, 41 for the collective. The battle opened when the destroyer's swift calculation detected an anomalous sensor reading that turned out to be collective stealth frigates positioned behind asteroid cluster designation K70745. The alien commanders listened in growing amazement, as Sarah reconstructed not just the broad strokes of their strategic decisions, but the minute details of individual battles, the reasoning behind tactical choices, even the specific communication protocols used during fleet engagements. RR 96. The economic crisis in the hegemony's outer territories. The world's mathematical approach to resource allocation created shortages in sectors 7 through 12, leading to civil unrest on planets Logica Prime and Quantus Secundus. This forced Admiral Korath to divert 3 cruiser squadrons from the front lines to maintain order, which General Korthax exploited by launching simultaneous raids on the Vega Supply Depot and the listening post at Alpha Centauri C. Director Thalen found himself frantically taking notes, trying to capture the flood of information pouring from the humans' apparently unlimited memory. The other alien commanders had gone completely still, their enhanced minds struggling to process what they were witnessing. Hour 218, the Zenthari Gambit. Commander Vexhai implemented a strategic deception by broadcasting false fleet positions through compromised communication channels, leading the collective to reinforce the wrong sectors while moving real forces through the Rigel Passage. However, General Korthax had anticipated this possibility and had positioned scout ships to monitor hyperspace fluctuations, so the deception was only partially successful. "Wait," Commander Vexhai interrupted, his telepathic voice carrying frequencies of profound confusion. "You remember my reasoning for the deception protocol? That was never communicated outside my command staff." Sarah smiled with the sort of gentle patience that suggested she was accustomed to this type of reaction. "You were calculating probability matrices for 17 different strategic options, while simultaneously monitoring your fleet's morale indicators. When Admiral Koreth suggested the direct assault on the collective supply lines, you rejected it because you realized their technologically superior forces would benefit from a straightforward engagement. You decided on deception because your analysis indicated a 67% probability of success against General Korthax's tactical profile." The Zenthari commander's mental voice went completely silent for several seconds. "I never spoke those calculations aloud." "You didn't need to," Sarah replied. "Your tactical decisions made the reasoning clear. Same way General Korthax's counter-positioning revealed that he understood your psychological profile better than you expected him to." She continued the reconstruction, hour by hour, battle by battle, decision by decision. She recalled the 3-way diplomatic summit at hour 347, complete with the specific wording of treaty proposals and the subtle, emotional undertones that had influenced the negotiations. She described the logistics nightmare that nearly crippled the coalition's advance on the Kepler Nebula, including the individual supply ship routes and the economic calculations that determined resource allocation priorities. Hour 512, the turning point at Centauri Station. All 3 factions converged on the strategic waypoint, leading to the largest engagement of the simulation. Initial forces. Hegemony brought 49 capital ships. Collective deployed 36 advanced vessels. Coalition committed their entire reserve fleet of 52 ships. The battle opened when long-range sensors detected quantum signature anomalies that suggested the presence of a 4th faction. The reconstruction continued for hours more, Sarah's voice maintaining its steady rhythm as she recounted the most complex military simulation in galactic history. She described technological breakthroughs, diplomatic betrayals, economic collapses, and the gradual evolution of warfare itself as the 3 factions adapted to each other's strategies. When she finally finished describing the last diplomatic meeting where territorial boundaries were redrawn and reparations negotiated, the chamber fell into the sort of silence usually reserved for religious ceremonies or really impressive explosions. "That's everything," Sarah announced, settling back into her chair with the satisfaction of someone who had just completed a moderately challenging puzzle. The simulation concluded with a 3-way partition of the disputed sectors, though the EER economic projections suggested the arrangement would probably collapse within 50 years due to resource competition and cultural incompatibility. Director Thalen looked down at his notes. Several dozen pages of frantically scribbled information that represented perhaps 5% of what the human had just recited from memory. His cybernetic implants had returned to their normal operational parameters, though they now carried a slight harmonic distortion that suggested either profound relief or the onset of a philosophical crisis. The implications of what had just occurred began to settle over the chamber, like a particularly heavy and thoughtful blanket. Here were beings who had spent centuries perfecting technological solutions to cognitive limitations, only to discover that another species had simply evolved past those limitations entirely. The new understanding. The verification process took 18 hours and involved every intact sensor array, backup system, and quantum fragment that the Galactic Military Institute could access. Director Thalen had assembled a team of the galaxy's best data recovery specialists, each one attacking the problem from a different angle, while Sarah waited patiently in the chamber, occasionally sipping tea from a simple ceramic cup. The results were impossible to argue with. Every recoverable scrap of data matched Sarah's reconstruction perfectly. Flight recorder fragments, partial communication logs, even quantum resonance patterns left in the chamber's neural networks. Everything aligned with the human's account with an accuracy that defied statistical probability. "Impossible," muttered Chief Technician Vorthak, staring at his displays with the expression of someone whose understanding of reality had just been gently but firmly relocated. The accuracy rate exceeds 99.7%. She's even correctly identified data errors in our own backup systems that we didn't know existed. Word of the incident spread through the academy with the sort of speed usually reserved for gossip about administrative scandals or really good cafeteria food. Reactions ranged from scholarly fascination to existential horror, with most falling somewhere in the uncomfortable middle ground of beings who had just discovered that their fundamental assumptions about intelligence might be completely wrong. The Fraconi faculty immediately began drafting research proposals to study human cognitive capabilities, their cybernetic minds already calculating the implications for their own enhancement technologies. The Xanthari instructors started questioning whether their species' reliance on telepathic amplification had actually hindered their natural development. The Corvani administration began quietly investigating whether they should recruit more humans for their strategic planning departments. 3 days after the reconstruction, Sarah found herself in Director Thalen's office, surrounded by the Academy's senior faculty and several very important-looking officials from the Galactic Military Council. The office itself was a study in controlled chaos with holographic displays showing star charts, tactical analyses, and what appeared to be someone's attempt to calculate the statistical impossibility of what Sarah had accomplished. "Miss Chen," began Counselor Vexithara, a Xanthari whose telepathic crown indicated senior political rank, "your demonstration has raised some rather significant questions about human cognitive capabilities. Our xenobiologists are having difficulty reconciling what you've accomplished with their understanding of baseline neural architecture." Sarah settled into her chair with the sort of comfortable confidence that came from spending most of her life being underestimated. "What would you like to know?" General Korthax leaned forward, his cybernetic implants flickering as they processed multiple conversation threads simultaneously. "Your species possesses no neural enhancement technology, no quantum processing implants, no memory augmentation systems. How is this level of information retention even theoretically possible?" "Practice," Sarah replied with the sort of simple honesty that suggested she either didn't understand the magnitude of what she'd accomplished or had grown completely accustomed to casual impossibility. "My grandmother could recite entire novels after reading them once. Said it was just a matter of paying attention to what you're looking at instead of thinking about what you're going to have for lunch." Admiral Zephok's collective consciousness rippled with patterns that indicated profound curiosity, mixed with a healthy dose of species-wide imposter syndrome. "You're saying this ability is common among humans?" "Well, not exactly common," Sarah admitted, "but not rare either. Most people these days rely on computers for memory storage, just like you do. But the capability is still there if people bother to develop it. We used to memorize epic poems that went on for days, complete family genealogies going back centuries, detailed maps of entire continents. My great-uncle could rebuild any mechanical device after watching someone disassemble it once." The silence that followed was punctuated only by the soft hum of Director Thalen's cybernetic implants as they processed this information. Finally, Counselor Vexithara spoke, her telepathic voice carrying frequencies that roughly translated to, "Please repeat that so we can determine whether you've suffered a complete psychological breakdown. Your entire species evolved this capacity naturally, Without technological assistance? Had to, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. We didn't have quantum computers or neural interfaces for most of our history. If we wanted to remember something, we had to actually remember it. Kind of like how you develop stronger muscles if you don't have anti-gravity assistance. Professor Quilneth, the Academy's leading expert on comparative xenopsychology, had been taking notes on a device that appeared to be having difficulty keeping up with the conversation. But the energy requirements alone, he protested, his eyes blinking in sequence. The human brain consumes approximately 20% of your body's total energy output. Processing and storing the volume of information you've demonstrated should require significantly more metabolic resources. Sarah shrugged with the sort of casual gesture that suggested she'd never really thought about the technical aspects of what she considered a basic life skill. The brain's pretty efficient when you actually use it properly. Most of the energy goes into active processing, thinking, analyzing, making decisions. Storage is relatively cheap, especially if you organize the information properly. Organize. It how? Director Thalen asked, his cybernetic eye focusing on Sarah with the sort of intensity usually reserved for unstable quantum reactors. Memory palaces, mostly. You create detailed mental structures and place information in specific locations. Then you just walk through the palace when you need to retrieve something. The more vivid and interconnected you make the associations, the more stable the memories become. Sarah paused, considering. Though for something as complex as your war game, I used a different approach, more like a living narrative that builds on itself. General Corthax's mechanical components whirred as he processed this concept. You're describing the simulation as a story? Everything's a story if you look at it right, Sarah explained. The war game wasn't just random battles and resource allocations. It was a narrative about 3 different civilizations, each with their own values, goals, and ways of understanding the universe. Commander Vexhi's strategic decisions reflected Zenthari cultural emphasis on methodical planning and risk assessment. General Corthax's technological innovations demonstrated Vraconi adaptability and their belief that intelligence can overcome any obstacle. Admiral Zephok's coordination strategies showed how the Corvani collective consciousness sees problems from multiple perspectives simultaneously. She gestured at the star charts displayed around the office. Once you understand the underlying story, the characters, their motivations, their relationships, the specific details become much easier to remember. Every battle outcome makes sense in context. Every diplomatic exchange reflects the deeper, cultural conflicts. Every resource allocation reveals something about the priorities and fears of the people making the decisions. The alien faculty exchanged glances that managed to convey several different types of existential crisis simultaneously. Here they had been treating the simulation as a complex data processing challenge, while the human had approached it as a narrative about people and cultures. You were analyzing our psychological profiles, Admiral Zephok said, the collective's voice carrying undertones of something that might have been admiration or might have been professional paranoia. I was trying to understand why you made the choices you did, Sarah corrected gently. That's the key to remembering complex information, understanding the underlying patterns that connect everything together. Your tactical decisions weren't random. They reflected your training, your cultural background, your personal experiences, even your species' evolutionary history. Counselor Vexathara's telepathic crown pulsed with frequencies that indicated deep contemplation mixed with growing concern. Miss Chen, are you suggesting that our military strategies are predictable based on psychological analysis? Sarah considered this carefully, understanding the implications of her answer. Not predictable exactly, but comprehensible. Every choice reflects the person making it. Commander Vexhi's preference for methodical approaches stems from Zenthari, cultural evolution. Your species survived by being careful and thorough. General Corthax's technological solutions reflect the Vraconi belief that intelligence can overcome any limitation. Admiral Zephok's coordination strategies demonstrate how collective consciousness approaches problems differently than individual minds. She paused, noticing the uncomfortable shifting among her audience. Understanding isn't the same as predicting. People can surprise you, especially when they're aware of their own patterns. But it does help with remembering what happened and why? Professor Quilneth had stopped taking notes entirely, his four eyes fixed on Sarah with the sort of attention usually reserved for discovering new laws of physics. The implications for intelligence gathering alone, he murmured. If humans can naturally analyze and retain psychological profiles of this complexity, that's not what this is about, Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying a note of firmness that hadn't been there before. I'm not here to help anyone spy on their neighbors or develop psychological weapons. I'm a translator. My job is to help different species understand each other better. Director Thalen's cybernetic implants flickered as he processed the diplomatic ramifications of what he was hearing. Miss Chen, the Galactic Military Council would be very interested in discussing potential applications of your abilities. The strategic advantages of having personnel who can analyze and remember complex situations with perfect accuracy would be considerable, Sarah agreed. But they'd also be dangerous. Perfect memory means remembering everything. The good decisions and the bad ones, the successful strategies and the disasters, the moments of cooperation and the times when people let fear or ambition override their better judgment. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the crystal plains of Nexus Prime where the morning sun was creating patterns of light that seemed to shift and flow like living things. You want to know what I really learned from watching your war game? It wasn't just the tactical data or the strategic decisions. It was how three different civilizations, each convinced of their own superiority, gradually learned to respect each other's strengths. Sarah turned back to face the assembled faculty and officials. Commander Vexhai started the simulation believing that methodical planning was the key to victory. By hour 200, he was incorporating collective technological innovations into his strategies. General Korthax began with confidence that superior technology could overcome any opposition. By hour 400, he was using coalition coordination techniques to improve his fleet's effectiveness. Admiral Zephok initially relied entirely on collective consciousness advantages. By hour 600, the coalition was employing individual, initiative protocols adapted from hegemony doctrine. The room fell silent as the implications of this observation settled over them. The war game hadn't just been about testing military capabilities. It had been an exercise in mutual learning and adaptation. That's what I'll remember most clearly, Sarah continued. Not the battle statistics or the resource calculations, but the moment when three proud civilizations stopped trying to prove their superiority and started learning from each other. That's the real story of your simulation. Admiral Zephok's collective consciousness rippled with patterns that suggested profound reconsideration of their fundamental assumptions. You're saying that the true value of the exercise wasn't the strategic data we generated, but the cultural exchange that occurred during the process. Both are valuable, Sarah replied. But the strategic data is just information. The cultural understanding is wisdom. Information tells you what happened. Wisdom helps you understand why it happened and how to do better next time. General Korthax's mechanical components hummed as he processed this distinction. Your species has a saying about this, don't they? Something about learning from history? Sarah smiled. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But remembering the facts isn't enough. You have to understand the human element that drove those facts. Every war, every conflict, every cooperation started with people making choices based on their understanding of the world around them. She gestured toward the simulation chamber visible through the office's transparent wall. Your war game generated billions of data points about fleet movements and resource allocations. But the most important information was much simpler. Three different species, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, learning to work together despite their differences. Counselor Vexithara's telepathic crown had shifted to frequencies that indicated thoughtful consideration rather than defensive concern. Miss Chen, what would you recommend we do with this revelation about human cognitive capabilities? Stop thinking of it as a revelation, Sarah suggested. Every species has natural abilities that others find remarkable. Zenthari telepathy, Vraconi technological integration, Corvani collective consciousness. These are all extraordinary capabilities that humans can't replicate. What matters isn't which abilities are most impressive, but how we can use our different strengths to understand each other better. She sat back down, her expression growing more serious. If you want my recommendation, it's this. Stop trying to enhance intelligence and start focusing on wisdom. All the processing power in the galaxy won't help if you don't understand what the information means or how to use it responsibly. Director Thalen leaned back in his chair, his cybernetic implants casting soft light patterns across his face as he considered her words. You're suggesting that we've been approaching the problem backwards? Not backwards, Sarah clarified, just incompletely. Technology can amplify intelligence, but it can't create wisdom. That comes from experience, understanding, and the willingness to learn from others, especially others who think differently than you do. Professor Quilnath had resumed taking notes, though his approach seemed more thoughtful now, less frantic. The implications for our educational systems alone, he mused. If we've been focusing too heavily on technological enhancement at the expense of natural cognitive development. You haven't been doing anything wrong, Sarah interrupted gently. You've been doing what made sense based on your understanding and experience. Now you have new information to work with. The question is what you're going to do with it. The discussion continued for several more hours, ranging across topics from xenopsychology to educational theory, to the philosophical implications of natural versus enhanced intelligence. But Sarah could see that the real change had already occurred, not in the specific information they were exchanging, but in the way they were thinking about intelligence itself. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself back in Simulation Chamber Alpha, but the setup was different this time. Instead of neural interface pods designed for enhanced minds, the chamber now included observation stations for unenhanced personnel. Instead of focusing solely on technological superiority, the new simulation scenarios emphasized cooperation and cultural exchange. The first mixed species training exercise was smaller in scope than the Great War Game, but more ambitious in its goals. Teams of enhanced and unenhanced personnel from different species worked together to solve complex problems that required both technological capability and natural cognitive flexibility. Sarah watched from her familiar corner as Xanthari telepaths collaborated with human linguists to develop new communication protocols. Vraconi technicians worked alongside Corvani collectives to create hybrid systems that combined individual innovation with group coordination. The results weren't always smooth, but they were invariably interesting. "How are we doing?" asked Director Thalen, settling into the observation chair beside her. Sarah smiled, making notes in a fresh notebook as she watched a Xanthari cadet teaching a human student basic telepathic techniques while learning memory palace construction in return. Better than expected, slower than hoped. About what you'd expect when different species start learning each other's natural abilities instead of just relying on their technological advantages. Any regrets about staying to help with the new program? Sarah considered this as she watched General Korthax demonstrating cybernetic integration principles to a mixed group of cadets, while simultaneously learning human pattern recognition techniques. No regrets. This is more interesting than translating diplomatic small talk, and someone needs to make sure you don't turn this into another arms race. Director Thalen's cybernetic eye focused on the collaborative exercises taking place throughout the chamber. The Galactic Military Council is calling it the most significant development in strategic education in over a century. Good, Sarah replied, turning to a fresh page in her notebook. Now let's see if we can make it significant for the right reasons. The war game that had brought them together was already becoming legend, not for its complexity or strategic innovations, but for what it had revealed about the value of different types of intelligence. Sarah's perfect reconstruction had become less important than the understanding it had created, that wisdom wasn't about processing power or technological enhancement, but about the willingness to learn from others and remember not just what happened, but why it mattered. In the end, that was the story Sarah would remember most clearly. Not the technical specifications of quantum computers or the tactical details of galactic warfare, but the moment when different species stopped competing to prove their superiority and started cooperating to understand each other better. And as she filled another notebook with observations about this new type of learning, Sarah reflected that some stories were worth remembering, not because they were complex or impressive, but because they reminded you of what intelligence was, really for her. Not just solving problems, but understanding the people behind those problems and finding ways to work together despite your differences. The universe, it seemed, still had room for the sort of intelligence that came standard with most species, the kind that evolution had provided free of charge, powered by nothing more sophisticated than curiosity, attention, and the patient willingness to remember not just facts, but the human element that gave those facts meaning. Sometimes, Sarah thought as she watched her students learn from each other, the most advanced technology really was the one you were born with.